Welcome, everyone. We want to welcome you to our March Brown Bag in Science. Today, we're really pleased to have Dr. Nancy Rodriguez as our presenter. This month, since March is National Nutrition Month, and we usually have a big tournament, basketball tournament going on right now, we thought it'd be fun to do something a little different. We asked Nancy to speak about nutrition science against the backdrop of the NCAA tournament. I'll tell you more about Nancy in a minute, but given her years as a sport nutritionist and her work with the UCONN men's and women's basketball teams, I don't think we could have found a better person to share some insights with us. So first, I'd like to say thank you to Nancy and to all of you for joining us today. Given the current situation and the changes that everyone is experiencing, I really appreciate your time and your interest today. Nancy's going to talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. During the webinar, if you have difficulty hearing or seeing her presentation, please log out of the webinar and log back in. It is likely due to your internet connection. If you have questions for Nancy, and we hope that you will, please type your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar screen, and we'll take questions following her presentation. Now for a bit of information about Dr. Rodriguez. Nancy serves as Professor of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Connecticut with joint appointments in the Departments of Kinesiology and Allied Health Sciences. She served as Director of Sports Nutrition in the Department of Sports Medicine for 17 years. She's an active member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, ACSM, and the American Society of Nutrition. Dr. Rodriguez completed a 3-year appointment to the Science Board of the President's Council on Fitness, Sport, and Nutrition, serving as chair in 2015. She has sustained a funded research program in the area of protein intake, protein utilization, energy balance, and exercise in populations across the lifespan and has received national, regional, and university teaching awards. Dr. Rodriguez serves on several editorial boards and is a member of the ACSM Board of Trustees. Her current scholarship efforts focus on whole foods as a source of essential amino acids and the concept of essential amino acids density in diet design for rehabilitative nutrition and healthy aging. This work has translated into considerations specific to plant versus animal-based eating patterns and skeletal muscle health. She has been a practicing dietitian for more than 35 years. So again, we want to thank Dr. Rodriguez for her time today. We'll now turn it over to her for her presentation. And Nancy will remind you to share your screen before you get started.
Okay, there we go. Are we all set?
We're great. We can see you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Lynette. And I want to share sincere thanks to the college for having me this afternoon do this brown bag discussion that's specific to performance nutrition and elite college athletes during the postseason. This slide illustrates the plan that I have in terms of moving forward with this presentation. And in the context of disclosures, there's really nothing that I need to share with the audience today other than the information that Lynette has given to you, and then the fact that at certain points in the presentation and as time allows, I will share different situations or experiences that I have had during the time that I spent as the sports nutrition over in the Division of Athletics. I'd also like to share that that's not really work that I've done completely on my own. You'll see as we begin to move through some of the different topics that it's not a situation with 700 athletes, 20-some teams that is very well managed alone. So as I move forward, I'll talk a little bit more in the context of that particular model, but I also want to say I have many, many students, former athletes, as well as interactions with athletic administration and coaches over the years that have really contributed to my successes, to my experience, and some of the wisdom that I hope to share with you this afternoon. The evidence-based resources, I'll share sort of a pivotal piece of information with you. Again, as I mentioned, I do want to consider model and philosophy that I feel was a little unique and may still be so at the University of Connecticut and perhaps at other higher institutions, Division I, maybe Division II, Division III programs, as well as the fact that this does translate over into work that I've done in the professional ranks with professional athletes and professional teams. I'm going to focus on a real basic aspect of sports nutrition practice in the context of energy and hydration and recovery, and I'll put that in the context of postseason performance nutrition applications, along with some other suggestions, and then wrap up with some summary and recommendations before we open up the afternoon's discussion to questions. The first thing I'd like to share with you is the 2016 position paper for nutrition and performance. The original document that was first prepared back in 2009, I worked on with Diana DeMarco and Susie Langlis. They were colleagues and friends of mine, and I will say that this was one of the many instances where the American College of Sports Medicine was joining with other professional organizations, and in this case, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Nutrition Academy or Dietitians of Canada, as well as the American College of Sports Medicine, to assemble professionals to talk about the role of nutrition in the context of human performance and health. The most recent publication is shown on this slide for you, and I would ask you to take some time, for those of you that are in practice, whether you're an athletic trainer, a dietitian, perhaps a coach, a strength coach, or even an athlete, because everything has really been summarized in the context of evidence-based guidelines for nutrition and performance. And I have to say that the set of authors that were on this position paper were outstanding, and their experience and practice is very concisely and effectively presented in this particular document. Many of the concepts that I'm going to talk about today are embedded in the Nutrition and Athletic Performance position paper. And again, if you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach out to me via email following the presentation if we don't get to all of those questions today. So in the context of the model and philosophy that has served me well over my time in the field of sports nutrition, I like to talk more specifically about the team approach. One of my points to bear, and in moving forward with continued training of students, future registered dietitians in the context of medical nutrition practice or sports nutrition practice, is that the model that I use really did evolve from the clinical context of a healthcare team, where in that particular situation, you're thinking about the patient, you're thinking about the attending physician, and then all of the other members of the support staff that provide essential support for an individual, so that by combining all of these resources and communicating effectively, you provide the best service and care for a patient. So in the context of athletics, I think that this team approach is a really excellent model to use. Again, you have to keep in mind that I pursued the work that I did over almost 20 years at the University of Connecticut with athletes, with athletic teams, and in the Department of Sports Medicine, by really engaging a number of individuals, because I also had a teaching and research program. But I use this model because it's what worked clinically, and it was something that I had come up over my time before getting to the University of Connecticut as being something that was really productive and very successful. It's also one of those types of models that allows you to have these phenomenal intellectual exchanges. Again, I would go back to the American College of Sports Medicine, its membership, and the fact that these interactions, the crosstalk between strength coaches, researchers, educators, athletic trainers, the nutritionists, and the physicians, that type of engagement in conversations to optimize performance of an athlete, of an athletic team, in the development of a program, I believe are essential to success, but also to the longevity of a program and to the ability for people to transition in and out and for success to continue, hopefully without major interruption or barriers that come into play. The other part of this, and I thought about it last night, and when I woke up this morning, I was like, I need to make sure that everyone that's online today realizes that the sports nutrition team is not just the coaches. And when I talk about coach, I talk about the head basketball coach. I talk about the assistant or associate head coaches that are involved and for in the context of basketball with the guards, with the forwards, with the centers, the strength and conditioning staff, those individuals that are really on the front lines day in and day out, which also includes athletic trainers, that in those types of scenarios, by engaging those individuals, then the athlete doesn't fall through the cracks. In the context of sports medicine at the University of Connecticut, I operated underneath the umbrella of the Division of Athletics within the realm of the Department of Sports Medicine. And I also found that working with physicians, the director of sports medicine, along with the orthopedist or the psychologist or other individuals that come into play for the care of an athlete, makes a huge difference. But in that context, remember that the team is dealing with the athlete. The team is dealing with the sport. And so the better able you are to sort of create this group of individuals that are constantly communicating and have a common goal, even though they may have these contributions that would seem isolated, that's what contributes, in my mind, to a successful model over time with accomplishing postseason wins, postseason championships. The essential components of this particular team rely on trust, the fact that the coaches trust you, the athletes trust you, that everything that's coming through is transparent, and that an athlete may choose to spend more time with their trainer or their strength coach. They're going to be very responsive to their head coach and their position coach. And so in the context of sports nutrition, if you are not engaged in those conversations, you're not being held credible by the coach, by his staff, then you're not going to be considered credible and a valid source of information for your athletes. So there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that there's trust, to determining what is the best way to communicate. Of course, in this day and age, here we are now, using a webinar, webcams, Facebook, but I'm a big face-to-face person. I also think that it's important to follow up, and it may be emails, it may be texting, it may be whatever mode of communication is going to be the most effective in a particular context. Another essential part of this is being flexible. All right. I remember my first athletic director, and in the context of talking about my role and my position and how things were going to work, was the point that was well made then, and I've carried it with me throughout my career, and maybe now it's a pearl of wisdom, is that successful coaches are not going to all be exactly the same. All right, their ideas about nutrition may be different, their philosophies about how they run practice, those types of things. That's why they're successful. They know what they're doing. That's their area of expertise. And for each of us within our own scope of practice, we know what it is that we can contribute. But you have to be able to speak the language. You have to be flexible and understand that what might work for team A is not going to work for team B. What might have worked for the championship teams, back in the 1990s may not necessarily be as effective, but could serve as an excellent template for athletic championships moving into 2000, all right, 2021, whatever that might be. So you have to be flexible, and I think that you have to trust yourself. And if you don't understand or you have questions, then instead of sort of going back and spinning your wheels, I'm a big proponent of ask the questions and get the information you need. Now, in this day and age when information is so readily available, I also encourage everyone to exercise caution. Use critical thinking skills. Consider some things yourself before you go out there and just want the information, because to be a credible and valid source and to actually have trust is people need to understand that you know these fundamentals and that you're able to implement them in whatever the individual or team or division need might be. And my practice from day one, and I have been a nutritionist, as Lynette indicated, practicing for about 35 years in the field. You know, if I go back and count my early years in graduate school and practicing then, my model and my philosophy has always been a foods first approach. Now, that's an important context because we really want to make sure that we're teaching our athletes how to eat well, not only while they're in season, not only for the postseason and postseason for success, but also for their own personal health and well-being, and for longevity in the sport and longevity in life. Now, we can't walk away from that, and I'm sure many of you are sitting there where we can't always just rely on food. There are certain situations where we might have to consider supplements, and I would agree with you. All right, and so what I've done on this slide is just put up some main points that I think are critical in the context of considering supplementation for athletes, for teams. One is a rationale. It's very important that athletes understand what they can get from their diet, how to succeed in getting that from their diet, and that's some of the plans that we develop and some of the tools that we choose to implement through dining services, through training tables, in combination with fueling stations, etc. But there needs to be a good rationale and there needs to be a good justification for it. Why? Because, you know, you see at the bottom there, safety and liability. We need to make sure all of our supplements are safe. Not all supplements or supplement lines sometimes are going to be readily accessible to athletes. Even though the NCAA may have some mandates regarding accessibility and meals and foods and snacks, there are still budgets that individuals have to adhere to during the course of their practice, and so that can make a difference. With regards to incorporating these supplements into the diet design, which is an essential part of what we need to do and something that is often overlooked, is that you have to consider timing. All right, when athletes are coming in for breakfast, all right, at our basketball facility and then heading to practice, and then you want to think about what they're going to have as their post-practice supplement, you have to consider, well, how does that mesh with school, with schedules, right? With academic schedules, with getting to tutoring, with getting to class, with going to labs. So it's a little bit more complex than just, you know, drinking a sports beverage or grabbing a bar, running into the fueling station and out. It really has to be a component of the entire diet and design, and there have to be considerations made for the safety of the athlete, for the safety of the institution, and also to consider certain aspects of liability and what's ethically right and wrong and how you're going to navigate that, because for many of us, ethics are quite different. So that being said, if we're going to sort of stick with the theme of, well, how are we going to feed our athletes, and, you know, realizing that we want to talk about meals and food, and then we also want to talk about the fact that there could be constraints with time, with appetite, what are going to be some of the methods that we're going to have to focus on in terms of what has to be provided, particularly in the context of the postseason. I'm going to focus on a few fundamentals. And so we're going to start off by talking about energy. We're going to talk about hydration, which I think are really the primary components of sport nutrition. They're very simple, but they're also extremely broad in the context of sports nutrition and human performance. I'm going to mention recovery, and I have on this slide, I went back and forth, just this concept of consistency. And I wrap up talking about consistency, but let me make a point for those of you that are here today. Being consistent is probably one of the more elusive aspects of what our athletes have to manage, particularly at the collegiate level. You know, breakfast every day, realizing that weekends could be very different than weekdays, and the fact that if you can sleep in on a weekend, that might mean that you're going to miss breakfast. And so now how are you going to get those 3 meals in? For many of our athletes, they really begin to learn early on in their career. Hopefully, you get to them by the time they're freshmen, definitely transfers, sophomores, or junior, that, consistency really becomes a key to success. You can work all week long on how to eat well for performance, or how to maintain or gain body weight in the context of their lives as student athletes and their training in terms of strength and conditioning and practice. However, when the weekend comes, they've got 2 days that if they choose to make those their quote unquote cheat days, which is not one of my favorite terms, but I won't digress, is that they have to understand that, here and there, some changes that are not consistent with their behaviors over time can actually undermine their success and can undermine some of the goals that they've worked so hard to achieve. And that's definitely true when you begin to move to the postseason. What athletes learn, what athletes are doing during the season is critical. So I am going to interject for you this point. And another, again, philosophy is the fact that we really try to get to athletes during the off season, when they come in as freshmen, when they're there during the preseason, because with nutrition, what you'd like to do is set up a model, set up a template for an athlete that is going to be fluid, all right, from the preseason to the competitive season, to the postseason, to the off season, something that's going to be, fluid in the context of those particular types of demands, but at the same time, once they have that, it allows them to focus on what their real job is. All right, eating becomes a job, taking care of their body is a job for scholarship athletes, for collegiate athletes. But I often tell coaches and tell athletes, and we'll share with you, you do not want nutrition to be a distraction. You do not want the way that your athletes eat to be something that begins to consume so much of their time that they're not able to do what they need to do, which is watch film, which is learn the playbooks, understand what goes on in the context of the season, work with teammates. So having this big picture and then understanding that some of these concepts I'm going to highlight for you this afternoon move from the season into the postseason and must be sustained is what's really a key to, seeing folks really become more successful and eventually reach the end stage of competition and have success. So we'll talk first of all about energy and calories and then hydration status. But what I want to mention with regards to energy is the fact that we typically look at that with regards to performance and weight management. For the postseason, weight management hopefully is not going to be one of those distractions or one of those keys. When athletes move from the preseason to the competitive season, they should be at a weight or be within a weight range that now they're able to hold and continue to move through. Now that isn't to say in working with our basketball teams and working with our football teams or our hockey teams, sometimes as that competitive season revs up and it's in the context of academics, nutrition and sleep are usually the first 2 things to go, and those are usually the most central to recovery and to continued success. But weight management is not something I'm going to address so much today, as I'm going to focus on aspects of performance. When we talk about calories, many of you will recognize we're talking about carbohydrate, protein, and fat. As a protein nutritionist, I think the last thing we want to do is use protein as an energy source. Fat becomes very important in terms of meeting calorie needs and sustaining athletes. But what becomes very critical in the context to postseason performance is where are our athletes with regards to the fuel that's in the muscle, the gas that's in their tank, because that muscle glycogen that's there is directly related to the work that they're able to perform. In the current context of exercise performance, we've moved from it's not just endurance, it's not just strength and power. We know now that in the context of basketball, soccer, in different positions for football or hockey, is that you're working with high intensity, low intensity. You're working with, moderate aspects of fuel utilization, but typically in the context of competition, glycogen stores become vital. And so what this slide shows you is that if muscle glycogen begins to go down, the ability for the muscle to do work becomes compromised. And as you might anticipate, there is a way for us to feed our athletes. There is a way, really, we don't feed them anymore. At this age, they're actually eating, but the recommendations that we make are actually going to be carb-based recommendations. What this particular figure illustrates to you, and this is based on research, really very well documented for some period of time, that low carbohydrate diets are not adequate to really replenish glycogen stores over the context of when that needs to take place. There's a time frame that you see on this slide, about 48 hours. With regards to some of our athletes, when I have a coach that has come to me or talked about the fact that it seems like the athlete is willing, they're really trying to work hard, but their ability to perform is not there. We do nutritional assessments, we sit down and we look at what they're doing. More often than not, we've been able to determine that they're what we would call glycogen depleted. And with regards to glycogen depletion, it's usually associated with different aspects of their dietary behavior. When the Atkins diet came full force, a couple of decades back, athletes were using a carb-free diet to lose body weight and then to reintroduce carbohydrates. They were a little carbohydrate phobic, they became a little bit concerned. And what's critical to replenishing glycogen, maintaining glycogen, and getting athletes to succeed in the postseason is that they're consuming adequate carbohydrates. This next slide is just an illustration of that point. If you were to look at training, or even if you were to substitute those small blue bars across this axis here in terms of times and hours, you see that if those were even competitions. So 2 points. First of all, to fully replete an athlete, you'd like to have about 48 hours, but I can tell you that that's not always the case. In one of the second dual championships that I worked with at the University of Connecticut, one of our teams went into the Big East. They had not had a very successful season. Winning the Big East championship was key to them getting into the NCAA championships. And I can tell you that when you went into the Big East and you did not have a top seed, that required playing every day. And in the case of that particular situation, there wasn't going to be that ability to rest and recover and have carbohydrate intakes high enough that you were going to be replenishing to a large extent. That meant that I had to work very closely with the staff, the athletic trainer, the strength coach. Again, a very essential component of the model that allowed us to have success at the University of Connecticut was, how do we get them as replete as possible going into that 5-day with the hope of them coming out as championships, and what are some of the actions that we're going to take? Well, some of those actions were going to be certainly the diet prior to, and then what was going to happen after the games, all right, during the evenings, day in and day out. And so that's where we're going to move into this focus. And I'm going to just show you these plates. I really am not responsible for this information. The first time I saw it was at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. There have been a number of my colleagues who've done beautiful jobs with this, converting it to vegan meal plans, making different adjustments. But what you see are the different designs of the plate. And in the case of the postseason, as you might imagine, what we're going to do is we're going to move more to a plate that's going to be providing more carbohydrates. So we're going to be relying on consistent consumption of at least 3 meals a day, and probably a focus on snacks, that the protein that's there is going to be very high quality, and it's going to be adequate to meet protein recommendations for these elite athletes, but there's going to be carbohydrates that need to come in on a routine basis. Now, this is a meal pattern and a plate that is a slide that one of my students did, and we actually used with our men's basketball team. But what I did is asterisk this for you, because if you're looking at it, you're going, oh, there's no dairy. What about dairy, Dr. Rodriguez? You have to remember that, particularly for collegiate athletes and for individuals that are hoping to achieve peak bone mass up to the time that they are, 30 years of age, they have to be getting in adequate amounts of calcium. So we are going to embed milk into these diet designs and good sources of calcium, but that's an illustration for you just to kind of keep in mind. This post-exercise carbohydrate pattern that's there is just simply to reinforce for you the fact that there is a window of opportunity that happens immediately after exercise is complete, and in the context of carbohydrate repletion, you do want to take advantage of that. So for example, in that series of 5 days in Madison Square Garden, when the guys finish and they're running off the field and they're getting in and they're going to the locker room to recover, to shower, get cleaned up and head out for their meal, then a carbohydrate-based beverage was a critical beverage. Now, for everybody on the team, no. For the athletes that we know need that is the rationale and the justification for doing that. Considering a high versus a low glycemic index is the fact that we know that if you combine an elevation in insulin and the increased blood flow with the fact that there's improved insulin sensitivity following exercise in the muscle, you have an opportunity to do the best you can to replenish glycogen stores, and then with the following meals and with rest and practice, get your athletes there. This slide just gives you some different options, and again, to individualize for athletes and moving forward with those different types of replenishing measures. And with that, kind of my segue was moving from the beverages to get you to hydration, is just to emphasize the fact that we can live a lot longer without food than we can without water. And hydration is very well documented to contribute to physical and cognitive performance at an optimal level. And so these next slides kind of bring that into play by talking about sort of a minimum. And again, in a moment, I'll indicate how you determine these hydration needs, but regular consumption of water is critical. And in the context of water to replace weight that's lost in sweat, that's another important and essential component. I attribute this to Dr. Larry Armstrong, Dr. Casa, their staff, who has done a fabulous job over the course of their years in the field of hydration, along with other international and national researchers, but ultimately understanding that there are some easy ways for our athletes to think about being hydrated, and also for nutritionists, athletic trainers, and strength coaches to recommend how much an individual needs. So I said 3,000 mils on the prior slide, but if you have an athlete that has a 4,000 calorie requirement, then we're going to set their basic needs at 4 liters, all right? Without a doubt, as Dr. Armstrong used to say, a pint's a pound around. No matter what, for each pound of weight that's lost, it's important for individuals to replenish that, simply because with regards to performance, as little as 2% body weight lost in water will compromise endurance performance. Up to about right around 3% will compromise strength and power. And then for cognition, somewhere, along those lines, you're losing that. So it's important that our athletes understand something as easy as a color test, and that their urine should be as light as possible. And then when you're managing athletes and working with them, keeping track of fluid balance and making sure that there's not substantial weight loss in the context of fluid losses subsequent to sweat. We talk about programmed hydration, routine consumption throughout the day. So many of our athletes will leave us with a hydration schedule, something that becomes a routine for them to make sure that they stay hydrated. As I sort of move to the end here, I'm just going to make a couple of comments, so we do have time for questions. These are what we call the 4 R's of recovery, but the 2 that I've asked you to focus on for the postseason and for really ongoing success based on consistent diet behaviors, carbohydrate consumption, is to rehydrate and to replenish fluids and glycogen, and then also to get adequate rest. Rest is very critical to athletic performance. And so this slide just gives you a list of some of the points that we've assembled over the years. One of the things that I haven't been able to address, it's a pretty tight timeline that we have here, but I do want you to realize that when athletes are traveling and athletes have the demands of a travel schedule, you know, having a routine and having certain things in place to help them optimize rest is going to be very, very important. I remember having discussions with the coaches for one of our teams after meeting with the athletes, because when they traveled, they were up at 6 or 7 a.m. so that they got breakfast. And the athletes were exhausted. They would get up and eat breakfast, and then they would lay around the rooms or go out maybe for a little stroll in the parking lot at the hotel. And when we finally were communicating and everybody was on the same page with how we could make this a better situation, is we realized another hour or 2 of sleep's probably a good thing. And there are ways for us to design a brunch, you know, a late breakfast, combine that with a pregame and a postgame so that we're still able to do everything that we need and combine recovery with adequate rest and achieve, you know, rehydration, replenishment, as well as allowing them adequate time to repair so that they were able to succeed. So the summaries and recommendations are here for you. Consistent implementation of these principles that are specific to fueling, hydration, and recovery. Being able to effectively translate science to practice, appreciating what's reality. They're traveling, what's reality? What's going on at the hotel? What can you get into the locker room? Being flexible. You cannot, you know, lose sight of the fact that you have to be adaptable. That's in the structure of what athletes and what people do. We have to be able to relax and have some flexibility that's there. So you have to know the language. You have to understand the game or the games. By instilling different behaviors and consistencies in our athletes and in our programs, you instill confidence, which can go a long way in terms of sports psychology. I always, even with some of the athletes I worked with through this recent postseason for track and field, for the indoor season, it's always, you know, you're ready, have fun, enjoy what it is that you're doing, because that's really what's going to be key to longevity and health in the long run. So with that, I will thank you for the additional time and open it up to any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Nancy. That was so interesting. We have several questions, so we're going to dive right in. So one question is, how might things be different for an athlete that is vegetarian or vegan?
All right, so that's a very good question. And we've certainly had some of our elite athletes who are vegetarian and or vegan. So I'm going to start first of all with a vegan. In the context of a vegan, with regards to, well, for both of them, you have to determine energy needs and you have to determine protein needs, and then you also have to figure out carb replenishment. Then what you have to do is you have to look at that particular practice. I will change my mind and I'll start with the vegetarian. For a vegetarian, we have a lot of options because we can include different protein sources and different food sources that will allow them to meet those particular recommendations, which are essential to maintaining muscle for the duration. For glycogen replenishment and for carbs, for either the vegetarian or the vegan, that does not become so elusive. You can still do that, all right, because of the behaviors that they have and the practices that they've embraced as either a vegetarian or a vegan. You can accomplish the calories, you can accomplish the carbohydrate recommendations to get you where you're going. With regards to getting it in totality with protein and with particular supplements, you have to be a little bit more vigilant. And that's when I say, wherever you may be as an athlete, as a coach, as a strength coach, or as a nutritionist, our athletes need to be much more diligent. So we have some focused behaviors that we work with. We have some focused products and approaches that we take that are specific to supporting our vegetarian and vegan athletes. You also have to think about the micronutrients, the iron, all right, the B vitamins, B12 in particular.
Okay,
I'm not
great.
sure if that answered your question, but
did. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. So another question is, how does diet change when an athlete is injured, and what is the role of nutrition and food in helping an athlete recover from an injury?
Well, thank you. That's one of our recent areas and where we've been spending the last couple of years is that, and it's interesting, it takes me full circle to an article I wrote in Athletic Training Today many, many years ago that really discussed the fact that athletes, when they are injured, one of the biggest fears is weight gain. And it's not just weight gain in the context of muscle, it's weight gain in the context of fat, also the fact that they're going to be losing opportunities to train. So a couple of points. First of all, athletes do need to eat when they're injured because they have to support healing and they have to support recovery. So it's, again, going back, doing a good assessment and figuring what the athlete needs in the context of weight maintenance or weight management, not typically weight gain, all right? But you have to figure out where you are in terms of calorie needs and are you going to be in balance, positive or negative energy balance. With regards to that, it's become more readily apparent. We do have a couple of reviews that have just come out, one in Advances in Nutrition and another in Frontiers, where we've talked about the role of higher protein intakes to offset muscle losses and disuse atrophy. So we believe that consuming protein within the recommended ranges for athletes anywhere from 1.2, really to 2 grams per kilo body weight needs to be embedded in that particular diet design to offset muscle losses. And then in the context of the total diet, you have to start looking at the micronutrients that are very important in terms of immune function, in terms of recovery, such as vitamin C, zinc, vitamin A, considerations in that context. I'm going to sort of defer any conversation specific to collagen because I think we're just in the early stages of determining whether or not collagen is going to be something that's more substantial or is going to run more parallel to something like glucosamine and chondroitin in terms of supporting joint health and joint recovery.
Great. What do you recommend, Nancy? So for an athlete who's going to be sitting down for a few hours during class, and that might be an opportunity to consume some snacks, what do you recommend for energy intake with a snack that they could just, easily eat during class?
All right, so a couple of things. I teach my sport nutrition class at UCONN in the fall, and I teach it from 12:20 to 1:05, and I have many athletes that come into that class, and those athletes are going to typically be going from class to the training room to get taped, to get treatments, to get ready, and I don't want them going in and when the trainer or the coach asks them if they ate something, they said, no, I was in class. So first thing is, as I always share with athletes, either in my class or when they're going to classes, if it's during the lunch hour, all teachers would rather see athletes eat and stay awake than start to doze off because they're hypoglycemic and they're not eating enough. If they're athletes that have high energy demands, they can stop and get a wrap. We actually have a process where they can go into dining halls and grab to-go meals and things like that, if that's been justified in the context of the athlete's schedule. So, a burrito, a sandwich. In terms of snacks, we talk about, hummus and pretzels. We talk about carrots and peanut butter. We also talk about nuts, granola, cereals that they can, peanuts, things that they can trail mix, something that they can snack on in that context. bringing in a chocolate milk is absolutely fine. Things like that are the types of snacks, things that grabbing an energy bar, grabbing an apple, grabbing a banana, grabbing a Go-Gurt or a string cheese, a couple of them when they're going through the fueling station.
Great. So we had a question about fruit carbs versus grain carbs. Are they the same? Do you view them the same?
No, that's a good question. Fruit carbs are different than grain carbs because typically when we're looking at a fruit carb, we would think of it as either being a moderate or high index, glycemic index type of a food source. There are more simple, there's simple sugars. So if you drink a glass of orange juice, you're going to rapidly digest, absorb, and assimilate the glucose and get a greater increase in blood glucose. If you eat an orange, maybe a little slower with regards to pectin. An apple, a banana, those have soluble fibers, so they're more moderate. So fruits are different because they're going to be categorized in that kind of a context. I don't typically, we don't really restrict fruits per se by saying, oh, it's a simple sugar, it's going to perpetuate your insulin, and that's going to cause you to make more fat. There's a place for these that are in the diet. It's not really an added sugar, added carbohydrate source. Cereals and grains, depending on whether you're talking about pasta, breads, quinoa, rices versus a potato, all right, or broccoli or carrots, they're all going to be varied in terms of their fiber content. Many of them have what we call insoluble fiber, which is going to pass through and allow the gut to exercise and not be digested, which is very healthy for the gut and exercising the gut muscles per se, and then the soluble ones for swelling. So they are different. We would call those vegetable and plant fibers a little bit more complex for that reason. I think all of them can fit. It's the added sugars. So let me give a quick example for recovery. Had an All-American runner, and getting in the carbs post-run, even for practice, the athlete did not want to do a sports beverage, a commercial beverage, all right? Did not, at the time, the fructose, and now we don't have to worry about corn syrup. So what I did is over that 45-minute window of opportunity is we started with a yogurt. We started with, and then we moved to like a piece of fruit or vice versa, and then real fruit juice, not fruit juice that's 10% fruit juice and 90% sugar. But again, that's the flexibility and adaptability. I didn't say, oh my gosh, you can't just drink this beverage and take care of it. I said, okay, I understand that. We've had some athletes that those simple carbohydrate sources might contribute to migraines or other types of, you know, be uncomfortable for an athlete. So you have to make those adjustments.
Great. So you talked about a window for carbohydrate, and what about protein? If someone's going to do a protein shake, is there a specific window of time after, you know, activity that they should be consuming that?
All right, so that's an excellent question, and you could have any number of my colleagues, Steve Phillips, Doug Patton Jones, Luke Van Loon, we all maybe talk a little bit differently about that because in the context of protein, the machinery that turns on, and if you've got an older athlete, we talk about anabolic resistance to protein, there's a time frame that follows so that when you have, for example, I'll use a chocolate milk because that's easy, but we know there are a number of products that mimic milk or they're highly filtered, so the protein is higher and the ratio of carbs to protein may not be 4-to-1, it could be 3-to-1. Those combinations, I mean, I think that in my recommendation, we usually talk about the athletes getting that protein in within an hour, all right? Not so much, you know, immediately after would be nice, but again, it has to be in the context of the particular athlete, the team, and what's going on with meals. For example, if I have someone who's finishing football training and conditioning or practice, and they run them through in groups because they're larger teams, and they're finishing at 11 and they're going up to training table at noon. I don't want that athlete to necessarily consume 25 grams of protein post-exercise unless I'm going to move them up to lunch and realize that that means now they're not going to be able to eat, a chicken sandwich. So I'm going to be a little bit more thoughtful. For a hockey athlete, for soccer players, and in the case of some of our basketball players, when they're coming off the courts or they're coming off practice and they've been doing more aerobic, high-intensity training that's depleting glycogen stores, then the carbs become more important, and I steer away from that. But for protein, when I teach it, I do talk about the window of opportunity within an hour after exercise per se, but I qualify it because I would say the jury is still out. I think that there's always discussions for those of us that are in the field of protein. Do you need to have extra leucine? If you're talking about leucine and you're looking at the time frame for when it turns on the protein synthetic machinery, there are some variations that are there. But I like to think that after a workout, if there's time in between a meal, that post-exercise protein source, whether it's a shake, a whey shake, whether it's a milk beverage, can have a good place in helping the athlete recover and for muscle repair, maintenance, and synthesis.
Great. All right. We are winding down, unfortunately. We're going to take a few more questions. First of all, is there a difference between preseason, in-season, and postseason in macronutrient needs?
That's another excellent question. Depends on the sport, depends on the position of the athlete in the sport, depends on where they are in the context of weight management. So for preseason, you can do things quite a bit differently because what can happen is an athlete may be transitioning from the off season. Now, for a number of institutions, the off season, if it's over the summer or if it's in the spring, the athletes are right there, so they're practicing and they're engaged. Many of our athletes go home. All right, so when they come back for actual preseason and they get evaluated where they are they in shape? Are they at the appropriate weight? If body composition is an issue, they're going to be evaluated. So preseason may, in certain situations, encompass a variation in the macronutrient profile, in my professional opinion, all right? As athletes move from preseason into the actual season, then things might begin to break down just a little bit more. So for example, I may find that in the context of a football team, that I'm having to up the carbohydrates. I may have to make adjustments with the protein for my safeties, for my corners, for my wide receivers. I may have to make some adjustments now for an offensive versus a defensive lineman, depending on what it is they're doing in the context of actual play, maintaining their body weight, maintaining their body mass, but they're not going to be doing two-a-days. They're not going for basketball. They may not, or soccer, they may not be. Lots of times those teams will practice twice a day, and then at night they actually have games or they have pickups or they're doing other things. So we have to replenish that. So there, in my mind, you do have to consider the option that macronutrient profiles can change moving from preseason into the actual season. As athletes move through the competitive season and head toward the postseason, as games become more frequent and play becomes more intense, then there could be a modest shift to take carbs up just a little bit more, and also changes with regards to calories. So I do view all of those as being more fluid than I do as always being standard or set. Granted, there can be templates for each of those that we use, but if you just take a handout that someone has given you off of a website and this is what it is that you need to do, that may not necessarily accommodate this individual aspect or position aspect that I believe is pretty critical in achieving success in collegiate athletes across the board in all their different sports, with all the different demands that are there, like swimming and things like that.
Great. All right, we're going to take one more question. I've actually combined two questions into one. So.
Okay, Lynette, before I take that, I do want to just make one other thing. You have to also keep in mind, for whoever asked that prior question, is that in some sports, athletes begin to taper going into the postseason, and in other sports, things, become a greater occurrence. So that's another reason for just keeping in mind the fluid nature of these different types of seasons and how you would design the diet.
Yeah, that's a great question, or a great point. Thank you for adding that information, Nancy. So the final question is, so what are some of the latest fads that athletes are trying? And we're getting a lot of questions about this move towards plant-based diets. So maybe first, some things that you're seeing are happening, and then maybe some thoughts on athletes and plant-based diets. If they want to try that, when's a good time to institute that sort of change in their diet, et cetera?
All right, so a couple of things. Some of the things that I've seen and some of the things that we have to deal with and manage would be what you see in the general population that are specific to the keto diet, specific to the paleo diet, and whether or not there's a sound rationale for implementing those in any types of situations. Usually when I reduce carbs and increase protein in the context of calorie restriction for weight management or changes in body composition, an athlete sort of thinks, well, I'm doing the keto or I'm doing the paleo or things like that. But they're still typically eating what I would consider a diet that's not necessarily sexy per se, but is well-based in terms of balance, moderation, and variety. But I'm hoping that in being a participant today, that individuals understand that these particular practices probably not sustainable for the long term with regards to optimizing sports performance in the competitive postseason. Very rarely. All right, I'll qualify it. Also, another big fad and another approach that athletes are doing is the whole intermittent fasting piece, and trying to see whether or not that can help them in the context of changes in body weight or changes in body composition. And I don't really scorn that. I mean, it's been maybe in the last decade where we did a symposium at ACSM on intermittent fasting, but at the end of the day, when you eat 3 meals a day, that's intermittent fasting. If you decide that you're not going to eat anything from 8 to 12, and then you're going to eat between 12 and 8, it's a form of fasting. Our bodies, when you go to bed at night, you sleep through the night, you get up in the morning, you fasted. So intermittent fasting is another thing that's out there, and it's really educating athletes and getting them to understand what that means in the context of performance. I've always felt that the linchpin and the major button that usually has contributed to my success or my students and our team's success and coaches and moving forward is athletes all want to perform better. So it's how do you put that in the context of what the goals are and how are you going to achieve that? So paleo, keto, intermittent fasting would be some of the ones that I'm there that I would say. Also, trying to rely on a supplement to make a big difference is usually a very elusive and non-successful endeavor. With regards to moving to vegetarian or vegan, I can honestly say this. She knows I've mentioned her. I got her permission years ago to talk about her. Diana Taurasi, folks like that had varied eating patterns when they were in college, and now as they've moved into the professional ranks and they become role models, they become icons, and they move to practice these different types of behaviors. What we've seen in our athletes that choose all at once on their own to go vegan, and without doing that in consultation with their coaches, their strength coach or their nutritionist, is that they end up getting into situations where there might be challenges that are specific to getting in adequate amounts of protein, getting in adequate amounts of other nutrients that might be critical to performance. And so they really need to do that cautiously. And again, as I mentioned earlier, with some due diligence, so that they're making sure that as they make those changes, they're doing it in a way that's actually going to be sustainable. And I mean sustainable in terms of consistency and optimal performance, but I also mean sustainable in terms of what's realistic for them to manage, not only as students, but as they navigate moving on into a healthy lifestyle post collegiate athletics.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just one more point, because I know that it's something that's out there, and I have mentioned, is that we also need to be very aware of the fact that in the context of the environment and some of these different approaches, everyone needs to be more thoughtful and sort of just believing that these different types of dietary behaviors are going to achieve some major change globally in terms of the environment, greenhouse gases, and things like that. We really do not have adequate research and adequate data at this point in time to make those types of global or generalized recommendations. I saw in the news this morning, it was very interesting, a radar that actually showed the changes in the environment, really the lack of pollution in Italy, just subsequent to emissions from people just not being out in their cars and traveling and moving around. So we have a long ways to go with moving to a particular vegan, vegetarian lifestyle or practice. One, what we know about it in the context of athletic performance, and two, in the context of sustainability in our environment. So thank you for letting me say that.
Sure. Yes. Well, thank you again for your time today, Nancy. That was a really wonderful, interesting presentation. I think we all learned a lot. Thanks to all of you that joined us remotely. ACSM really appreciates you and your interest. As usual, this webinar is being recorded. We will place it on the acsm.org website within the next week or so. And with that, we'll say thanks to all of you, and we will end the webinar for today.
Thank you. Thanks.